The Galactic Council voted against Earth. They didn't expect what came next. Part 1. The verdict at the edge of the void. The chamber was cold. Not the kind of cold that comes from bad heating or a forgotten thermostat. It was the kind of cold that a room gets when 412 alien species decide, in complete and total agreement, that your kind does not belong among the stars. It was the cold of a decision that has already been made before anyone in the room said a single word. The kind of cold that settles into the walls and the furniture and the air itself, so that even breathing feels like swallowing something final. I sat in the gallery and I watched it happen. My name is Laura Haynes. I am 34 years old. I speak 19 languages, including 4 that did not originate on Earth. I am a linguist, not a soldier, not a diplomat, not a negotiator. The Galactic Council gave me a single observer seat in the gallery because they considered me the safest possible version of a human representative. A note-taker. A translator. A face for the record. Someone who would sit quietly, absorb the proceedings, and carry the news home without making a scene. They were right about the last part. I did not make a scene. I sat in my assigned chair, which was smaller than it should have been because whoever designed the observer gallery had not built it with human proportions in mind, and I watched everything. The chamber itself was enormous. It was carved from black stone that had been brought, I had read, from a dead planet in the outer systems, a world that had been stripped of everything useful and then preserved as a source of building material for the Council's main station. The stone absorbed light rather than reflecting it. It made the room feel deeper than it was, like the walls were not walls so much as edges of something larger that extended beyond sight. The delegates sat in curved rows that stretched upward in a bowl shape, each section glowing softly in the light frequency of that species' home star. Blues and deep reds. Cold purples. One section burned a pale green that hurt to look at directly, and I had learned in my 3 weeks on the station to keep my eyes moving when I passed the VEF delegation. They were a species whose visual communication operated on frequencies that the human eye was not designed to process comfortably, and too much direct attention left a faint headache that lasted hours. Presiding Chair Orenville stood at the center of the chamber floor. She was nearly 3 meters tall, with a narrow body and 4 arms that moved independently when she spoke, each one gesturing in a way that added layers of meaning to her words, layers that the translation technology flattened entirely, which I always found frustrating and which the other delegates probably found reassuring, since they could not afford to have nuance reaching the wrong ears. She had been running the Galactic Council for 60 years. She was careful, consistent, and deeply intelligent. She was also, in the most honest assessment I could make, genuinely afraid of us, and fear, in my experience, is the most reliable driver of catastrophic decisions that an otherwise careful person can have. She read the Edict of Containment in the primary galactic tongue first. Her voice carried through the chamber without a sound system, which was an architectural achievement I had spent 3 weeks not being able to explain. Then she read it in 12 secondary languages, each one bleeding into the next in the professional monotone of someone who has rehearsed a document until it has become nothing but sound. The translators broadcast simultaneously into every species-specific earpiece in the room, and my own earpiece delivered the words in flat, mechanical English, arriving just slightly after the original, like a shadow following a body. By order of the Galactic Council, assembled in full quorum, the species known as humanity, indigenous to the 3rd planet of the Sol system, designation Earth, is hereby subject to the Containment Edict, effective immediately upon the completion of this session. All faster-than-light capable vessels registered to Earth or its colonies shall be rendered inoperable by activation of the orbital inhibitor grid within 90 galactic standard hours. All colonial outposts beyond the Sol system shall be frozen at their current operational status. All trade and communications between Earth and Council member species shall be suspended for a minimum period of 5 galactic years, pending behavioral review. The vote count appeared on every screen in the chamber simultaneously. In favor, 412. Opposed, 0. Abstained, 1. I found the abstention marker immediately. Vorkai section, upper left. A species that looked like very tall, very thin creatures with silver eyes and a stillness about them that, in a human, would have read as controlled grief. I had eaten lunch near one of their junior delegates twice during my 3 weeks on the station. He had been polite, asked careful questions about human food, and had looked at me on both occasions with an expression I could not entirely read but had filed away as significant. He was the only delegate in the chamber who had made direct, sustained eye contact with me more than once. Around me in the gallery, the other observers were already moving. Journalists from non-member worlds pulled out recording devices. A researcher from the deafened system spoke rapidly into a small sphere that captured audio. Several other beings I had not identified shifted and murmured in the particular way of people processing the news value of what they were witnessing. One small gray-skinned creature whose species I had never managed to identify looked at me with something that, in the architecture of its face, appeared to be sympathy. I did not need sympathy. I needed 30 seconds of open communication before the blackout began. I had already written the message. 7 characters. I had written it the night before, because I had known, not suspected, not feared, but genuinely known, how this vote would go. The council had been building toward it for 2 years. Every trade dispute, every border incident, every leaked memo about human expansion patterns and human development rates and human general refusal to slow down when politely asked, all of it had been pointing in one direction. I had said so, in writing, to the people who sent me here. They had hoped I was wrong. I had hoped they were right. Neither of us got what we hoped for. I opened my communication device under the edge of the gallery railing where it would not be visible to the observation cameras. I typed the word and sent it through the still open channel to Earth on the fastest relay I had access to. Adapt. For seconds later, the channel closed with a sound that my earpiece rendered as a soft click. The chamber emptied with the particular efficiency of a place that has just completed something and wants to move on from it. Delegates filed out in species-specific rhythms, some in orderly lines, some in loose clusters, the VEF delegation moving in their characteristic perfect unison that never failed to make the back of my neck tighten. No one in the departing procession looked at me. I was, as far as the Galactic Council was concerned, already a figure from a closed chapter. The last human in these seats for at least 5 years. A detail to be noted and archived. I stayed in my chair long after the chamber lights shifted back from their executioner's blue to a neutral white. I sat there and I thought about what had just happened, and I did it without anger because anger was not useful here and because I had spent enough years studying power to understand something important. The council had not done this out of cruelty. They had done it out of the same impulse that makes a careful person move a candle away from a curtain. They had looked at humanity, our history, our speed, our refusal to stay within the boundaries that geography or tradition or good sense tried to place around us, and they had seen something that their models told them was dangerous. They were not entirely wrong. We are a dangerous species. We have always been a dangerous species. 10,000 years of our own history makes that absolutely clear. But what the Council's models had failed to include, what their commissioned data and their long reports and their 412 votes had not accounted for, was the other side of the same coin. The thing that is inseparable from what makes us dangerous. We survive. We adapt. We build. We break things and we fix them. We have lived through conditions that should have ended us, geological disasters, self-inflicted catastrophes, every form of internal conflict imaginable, and we came out not weaker but stranger. Harder in specific ways and softer in others. More creative in the precise and driven way that things get creative when the alternative is simply ceasing to exist. The Council had seen our wars. They had not asked what we built in the years between them. They had seen our expansion and called it aggression. They had not asked what we were looking for. They had looked at our past and made a prediction about our future. But predictions require complete data, and the data they had been given, I was already sure of this, though I could not yet prove it, was not complete. It had been shaped. Curated. Offered to the Council by someone who needed the conclusion it pointed toward. I stood up from my seat. My footsteps were the only sound in the empty chamber. I walked to the observation window at the back of the gallery and looked out at the dark and the stars, a view the station offered in every direction, a constant reminder of the scale of what had been built out here over centuries by species who had managed to stop pointing weapons at each other long enough to build something worth protecting. Somewhere in that direction, past several layers of space I was not currently permitted to travel through without authorization, was Sol. And past it, barely a notation on the galactic map, was Earth. I thought about the word I had sent. Adapt. And I smiled, standing there alone in the empty gallery with the stars outside and the cold stone behind me, because the 412 delegates who had just voted to contain us had not thought to ask the question that every single one of their behavioral models should have opened with. Adapt into what? They were going to find out. Part 2, What We Built in the Dark. 61 days. That is the amount of time it takes a species with our particular qualities, our specific combination of engineering creativity, diplomatic stubbornness, and the kind of productive desperation that comes from having no acceptable alternative, to completely rearrange the strategic landscape of a situation that was designed to have no solution. I know this number precisely because I spent those 61 days on the council station, technically free, technically an observer, technically a person of no particular significance, while the people back home got to work. The communications blackout was real and absolute. I had no way to contact Earth and Earth had no way to contact me. What I knew about what was happening at home, I knew the same way a person knows a fire is burning somewhere nearby, not by seeing the flame, but by reading everything around it. The smoke, in this case, was the behavior of the council delegates. But let me tell you what I learned later. What was reconstructed for me through reports, testimony, and the personal accounts of the people who were in the rooms where the decisions were made. Earth did not hold a mourning period. There was no emergency broadcast from any head of government beginning with the phrase, "My fellow humans, today has been a dark day." There was no formal period of national grief, no extended session of political argument about whether the edict was legitimate, no week spent writing formal protests to a council that had just closed all incoming communications. Those things came eventually, for the public record. The public needed to process what had happened, and the public deserved space to do that. But in the rooms where decisions were actually made, in the offices and workshops and secure facilities where the people responsible for keeping humanity functional were gathered, those rooms did not stop moving for a single hour. Within 6 hours of the edict passing, a man named Oliver Grant had already assembled a working group of 43 engineers at a facility on the outskirts of Bristol. Oliver was 51 years old, powerfully built, and possessed of a restless energy that made sitting through long meetings visibly painful for him. He had spent much of his career in applied systems analysis with a focus on what he called legacy architecture vulnerabilities, a specialty that, until recently, had mostly been applied to old infrastructure and outdated security systems. For the last 8 months, at the request of Earth's Crisis Preparation Division, he had been applying that same focus to something considerably more ambitious, the Galactic Council's orbital inhibitor grid. The grid was the Council's primary mechanism for enforcing the containment edict. A network of satellites positioned in stable orbits above Earth and its colonies, each one broadcasting a suppression frequency designed to render FTL drives inoperable. The technology was 9 centuries old. It had been built in the aftermath of a conflict that predated human spaceflight by several generations and had been maintained ever since as the Council's most reliable enforcement tool. It had never failed. No species it had been used against had ever found a way to circumvent it. None of those species had been human. Oliver found what he called the old lock problem in 48 hours. The grid ran on a frequency standard established 900 years ago by engineers who were brilliant within the assumptions of their time. The assumption baked into the architecture, the one that 9 centuries of maintenance had never questioned because it had never needed questioning, was that any vessel attempting to operate its FTL drive through the suppression field would engage the field directly. Drive on, suppression field on, the two forces meeting head-to-head and the suppression field winning, every single time. The assumption had never modeled a drive recalibrated to treat the suppression frequency as ambient background rather than as an opposing force. It was an elegant and infuriating distinction. The difference between trying to break down a locked door and learning to walk through it sideways. Oliver's team tested the recalibration on a single unmanned probe on day 3 of the edict. The probe ran its FTL drive at full capacity. The grid showed it as contained. The probe was, in fact, across the system before the test was concluded. By day 7, the recalibration had been distributed to every FTL-capable vessel in Earth's registered fleet through a maintenance update package that looked, to any monitoring system examining it, like a routine software patch. The grid was still running. Every human vessel registered as contained. The grid was, from that moment forward, measuring a fiction. While Oliver's group worked the technical problem, a woman named Celia Ford was working a different angle entirely. Celia was 47 years old and had spent the past decade as Earth's senior xenodiplomat, a position that had, until recently, mostly involved managing trade agreements and scheduling meetings between parties who were politely competing for the same resources. She was quiet, meticulous, and possessed of a quality that I have always believed is the most underrated skill in any diplomat. She actually listened to the people on the other side of the table. Not to form rebuttals. Not to identify leverage points. She listened to understand what people actually needed, beneath what they were officially asking for. She had been keeping a file for 2 years. She called it the Overlooked. It was a catalog of 63 species, mostly non-council members or junior members with minimal voting weight, who had been, in her careful and documented assessment, quietly disadvantaged by the economic structures that the 3 most powerful elder species maintained across the council's trade networks. She had documented persistent food shortages that council agricultural trade policies had made structurally worse. Infrastructure projects that had been submitted for council development funding and denied, year after year, without clear explanation. Medical technologies that Earth had developed, tried to license to developing worlds at reasonable rates, and been blocked from selling because those technologies competed with products the elder species controlled. 63 species. 63 sets of needs that were not being met by the system currently in place. When the edict passed and the communications blackout sealed Earth off from the Council's network, Celia Ford opened her file and looked at it for a long time. Then she said to her assistant, a young man named Peter Cole, who later described this moment in several interviews as the one that reframed his understanding of strategy entirely, "We have been waiting for the wrong thing. We have been waiting for the Council to give us permission to grow. We should have been building the reasons for other people to want us to." The human colonies had gone dark on Council sensors starting on day 9. Not because they had been shut down. Not because Earth had accepted the edict's terms. Because they had quietly, without announcement, without any communication on any frequency the Council monitored, redirected themselves. 12 colonial vessels changed course and began moving toward worlds on Celia's list. They carried food supplement technology. Water purification systems adaptable to a wide range of atmospheric conditions. A compact medical fabrication unit that Earth had spent 5 years developing and had been blocked from selling by Council trade restrictions. They carried engineers who knew how to build working solutions from limited materials, and educators with specific experience in making complex technical knowledge accessible to people encountering it for the first time. They did not arrive and announce themselves as official Earth representatives. They arrived as individuals. As people who had heard there were problems and had the skills to help with them. They asked nothing in exchange. They set a timeline of 2 to 3 weeks per location and they worked. That detail, the asking for nothing up front, confused every species they visited more than anything else they did. On day 14, the government of a small world called Vethra Minor, dealing with its 3rd consecutive season of protein crop failure, sent a carefully composed message to their council representative asking why a group of humans had spent 6 days repairing their primary irrigation network and then left without presenting a cost statement or trade proposal. The council representative reviewed the communication twice before responding that she did not have an answer. On the station, I knew none of this. What I had was what I could observe directly, and what I could observe was the behavior of the people around me. I was housed in the station's long-term visitor wing, a section of the station designed for delegates who stayed for extended periods, which meant private rooms, access to the common areas and library, and a level of daily comfort that made it easy to forget, on a surface level, that I was here under constraint. I was not confined to my room. I was not prohibited from most areas. I had access to the station's public library communication terminal, approved for research use, and I was monitored the way someone is monitored when no one expects them to do anything worth watching. I spent those 61 days learning the station the way I learn languages, systematically, from the structure outward, finding the logic beneath the surface and following it to its edges. I learned the shift rotations of the maintenance staff. I learned which corridors had full camera coverage and which had long-standing blind spots that showed up in the maintenance request logs as pending repair budget approval, a phrase that appeared, I noticed, with remarkable consistency in facilities run by large organizations that had stopped worrying about details. I learned the informal meeting points that senior delegates used when they wanted to talk without a record, and I learned them by watching where people went when they thought no one was tracking them. On day 22, the Vorkai delegate who had cast the single abstention vote sat across from me in the station library and spoke without looking up from his reading screen. He kept his voice low and consistent, the way someone speaks when they want to appear to be talking to themselves. "You are being watched more carefully than you realize," he said. "Not by the security staff. By the delegates. They are trying to understand how your species responds to this kind of pressure. What are they expecting to see? I asked, keeping my own eyes on the historical text in front of me. Fear or aggression? Those are the frameworks they have models for. Fear produces compliance or withdrawal. Aggression produces escalation that can be contained by further force. Both outcomes are manageable. A pause. They do not have a model for what you are actually doing. I am reading, I said. The Council's historical archives are excellent. Very thorough documentation of how the major decisions of the past 9 centuries were made. Velkan, I had learned his name through patient cross-referencing of public delegate rosters, said nothing for a moment. Then, still without looking at me, he said something that took me days to fully understand. I voted to protect you, he said. You do not know how many petitions for a response far more permanent than containment were filed in the 18 months before this edict. The edict was the result that the moderate voices in this council fought for. I want you to be aware of what the alternative looked like. I absorbed that. I did not let it reach my expression. Thank you, I said. He nodded once, the slight forward movement of the Vorkai head that serves the same function as a human nod, and returned to his reading. I thought about what he had said for days afterward. Not with fear, I had already moved past the point where fear was useful, but with a recalibrated understanding of the forces at work in that chamber. The 412 votes had not all been equal. Some of them had been votes of genuine conviction. Some had been votes made under economic pressure from the 3 elder species whose trade networks touched nearly every council member. Some had been votes cast by beings who received the aggression index data, assessed it in good faith, and concluded that containment was a responsible response to a real problem. And some had been votes cast to prevent something worse. The council was not one thing. It was 412 things, each with its own history and its own fears and its own calculation about what survival required. That complexity was not a weakness, from where I was sitting. It was the most important thing I had learned in 3 weeks of watching, and it was the thing that made everything else possible. On day 61, I was eating alone in the station common room, a meal that consisted of the last of my brought-from-home supplies, which I had been rationing since week 2, when the alert lights shifted to yellow and stayed there. I asked a passing maintenance technician what had triggered the alert. She told me, in the half-distracted tone of someone relaying information they did not fully have the context to understand, that 3 human colonial signatures previously confirmed dormant had vanished entirely from the long-range sensor network. They were simply gone. Not disabled. Not responding. Gone. I looked at my food. I ate the rest of it with the steady deliberateness of someone who has just received exactly the news they were waiting for and does not intend to show it. Then I went back to my room and sat for a while with the particular feeling that comes when you have committed to a direction without being able to see where it ends and the first landmark you were hoping for appears exactly where you calculated it would be. It was not quite relief. It was something cleaner than that. It was confirmation. Earth had heard the word I sent. Earth had gotten to work. Part 3, The Shape of Human Patience. On day 63, the colonial signatures came back. Not where they had been. Not in the Sol system, and not in the frozen cluster of outposts the Council had logged and locked. They appeared on the long-range sensors in 3 separate systems that had previously registered no significant activity of any kind, 3 small, unaffiliated worlds that were not Council members, not under any territorial claim, and not, according to every standard that the Council used to assess such things, worth paying attention to. I was in the station library when the alert reached the common monitors. I watched the sensor readout update in real time on the screen at the end of my reading table, and I watched the timestamp on the reading I had been doing about Council legal procedure, and I noted that I had not moved from this room in the past 4 hours and that 6 separate members of the station's observation staff had walked past the library entrance since morning and each one of them had registered my presence. I wanted to be very clearly somewhere obvious when this happened. The Council's reaction was immediate and, from the specific vantage point of someone watching it through glass corridors from a technically unrestricted section of the station, deeply instructive. 14 delegates gathered in an unscheduled session within 40 minutes of the sensor update. Their body language through the corridor glass was a vocabulary I had spent weeks studying and could now read with reasonable accuracy. Rapid, overlapping movement. The physical equivalent of everyone trying to speak first. Followed by a sudden collective stillness, the kind that falls when one voice in a room says something that takes the weight out of the air and replaces it with the specific gravity of a new problem. I was summoned the following morning. The notice was written in formal council language, delivered by an automated carrier system, and described the meeting as an informal clarification session. I appreciated that framing. It told me more about the council's current confidence level than any direct statement could have. When a body with the authority to issue containment edicts against entire species needs to use the word informal to describe a meeting, it means the body is not yet sure how much authority it wants to exercise. The advisory committee met in a room that was smaller than the main chamber but designed with the same architectural philosophy: a circular table, high ceilings, materials that absorbed sound in a way that made every voice in the room feel isolated and precise. 6 delegates around the table, senior representatives from 6 different member species, each one someone I had spent weeks cataloging in my observational notes. The committee chair was Director Orn, a Durathi being whose physical stillness under stress was the Durathi equivalent of shouting. They had a holographic display running in the center of the table when I sat down. 3 colonial signatures in 3 unfamiliar systems. Director Orn said, "Please explain." I looked at the display. I let a beat pass, not long enough to be seen as calculating, but long enough to be seen as thoughtful. "Those are human colonial vessels," I said. "They were registered as dormant under the edict." "They were," Director Orn said carefully. "And then they moved." "Yes. The edict froze their operational status." Earth read that as a prohibition on active resource extraction and infrastructure expansion. I met his eyes directly. It said nothing about relocation. The relevant provision is the Vessel Operational Status Clause in the edict's 3rd paragraph. It specifies current operational status as the frozen condition. It does not specify location as a locked variable. Silence around the table. The specific silence of people who are looking for the error in an argument and finding that the error, if it exists, is theirs. Director Orn's secondary arms, the Durathi had 2 pairs, and the secondary pair functioned the way human hands do when someone is trying very hard to appear calm, folded tightly against his sides. The systems they have moved to are council adjacent. They are in unaffiliated open space, I said. No council membership. No pending application. No contested territorial status. They fall under the open transit provision in Article 7 of the Galactic Compact. The specific paragraph is 7-4 if the committee wants to verify. The Cathori delegate, a thin, pale being with very precise movements, whose species was known throughout the council for documentation accuracy and a deep instinctive discomfort with procedural ambiguity, looked at her data screen, then at me, then back at her screen. Her lips, which Cathori used as a secondary precision communication instrument, made a small movement that translated approximately as, "The filing does not match the expectation." "They are providing material assistance to resident populations," she said. "Yes." "In exchange for what consideration?" I looked at her steadily. "Nothing," I said. "No trade agreement. No political alignment request. No payment structure. They are providing assistance because the resident populations needed it and Earth has the means and the people willing to do it." The Cathori delegate looked at her screen again. This was not, I assessed, because the screen had new information. It was because looking at the screen gave her a moment to process a result that her standard models had not produced. "That practice is not consistent with standard galactic trade behavior," she said finally. "No," I agreed. "It isn't." Director Orn set both pairs of hands on the table surface. "The Council will interpret this as a deliberate circumvention of the edict's intent." "The Council is entirely entitled to its interpretation," I said. "But intent is not a legal standard. The edict is a document. What Earth has done is consistent with the document as written. If the Council intended to prohibit humanitarian assistance to unaffiliated worlds, that prohibition should have been written into the edict." I paused. "It wasn't. That is not an oversight on Earth's part." I waited a single beat, then added, "Earth is also prepared to discuss the evidentiary basis of the edict in any formal session the Council wishes to schedule. Specifically, we have questions about the methodology and sourcing of the aggression index cited in the preamble. We would find a transparent review of that data very helpful." It landed differently than anything else I had said. I was watching all 6 delegates when I said it, and the response was not uniform, which was the most useful thing about it. Director Orn's expression went to a controlled neutral that cost him visible effort. The Cathori delegate's screen-checking motion happened a fraction of a second too quickly. Two other committee members exchanged a glance that was over before I could have pointed to it but that I had caught and filed. There was something in the data. There was something in the data, and at least some of the people in this room knew what it was. I thanked the committee for their time and walked back to my quarters at the ordinary pace of someone who had nothing to hurry toward. Over the next 2 weeks, the human presence in unaffiliated systems expanded. Not in a rush, in the careful, deliberate rhythm of something being built rather than something being deployed. 4 more vessels appeared in new systems. Then 3 more. Each one following the same pattern: arrival at a world with documented unmet needs, deployment of personnel and resources, 2 to 3 weeks of direct work, departure without a bill. Council observers were dispatched. Their reports described identical situations in every location. Human personnel integrated into local communities with apparent ease. Technical knowledge shared without restriction. No political conditions attached. No formal framework established. Just people working alongside other people and leaving when the work was done. One of the observer reports found its way to me through Velkan, who had settled into a habit of leaving documents accessible on shared library terminals in rooms where I happened to be present. This particular report contained a note from the observing officer at the bottom of an otherwise standard field assessment. It read, "Subject: human personnel display no apparent strategic motivation for current activity. Behavior pattern is consistent across all observed locations and all observed personnel. Working hypothesis: the assistance itself is the strategy." I read that line several times. Then I sent a message to Velkan on the library's internal system that said only, "Your observers are catching up." His reply arrived 3 hours later: "They always have been slower than they think." The Council's public communication networks, which I had limited access to through the library terminal, were beginning to carry something new. Not from Earth, we still had no outgoing communication, but from the species that Earth's teams had been visiting. Small transmissions. Brief official reports to Council representatives from minor world governments. The language in them was carefully neutral, as such things always are, but the content was not neutral at all. A report from the Vethra minor government described human assistance as substantive and without condition. A report from a world called Cathis 4 used the phrase technical cooperation freely given. A third, from a system I had to look up because I had not encountered it in any of my research, contained a single sentence that stood out from the rest of the formal language around it. The humans asked only whether the work was done well. I spent an evening in the library reading every one of those reports that had entered the public record. There were 11 of them by that point. They were not dramatic. They did not celebrate Earth or describe humanity in elevated terms. They were the dry, factual dispatches of small governments reporting to a larger body about events that had occurred in their territory. But each one of them, in its quiet and careful way, was saying the same thing. Something happened here that we did not expect. And it was good. I thought about Velkan's first warning to me, that the Council was watching to see how humans responded to the edict. Fear or aggression? Both manageable. I thought about what they were seeing instead. A species that had been told it was contained, that its ships were locked and its trade was suspended and its expansion was stopped, and that species had responded by going very quiet and then reappearing in places no one had planned for, doing things that did not fit any model for how a contained species behaves. Not fighting. Not fleeing. Not collapsing into itself. Just showing up, helping, and moving on. The Council did not have a model for that because, in 900 years of managing galactic relations, they had never needed one. No species in their history had responded to containment by treating it as an opportunity to demonstrate something. On day 72, a delegate from a mid-sized Council species called the Theron approached me in the station common room. Not Velkan. Someone I had never spoken with directly, a being whose name I recognized from the delegate registry but who had given no particular reason to stand out in my observational notes. She sat across from me and looked at me for a moment before speaking. "We voted yes to the edict," she said. "I want you to know that. And I want to say that I voted yes because the data we were given indicated a real risk." I said, "I understand. I am reading the reports from the unaffiliated worlds," she said. "I have been reading them every day," she paused. "We were told that your species defaults to resource acquisition in all expansion contexts. That every engagement is ultimately transactional. Yes, I said. That is what the aggression index shows. The reports do not support that characterization. I looked at her steadily. No, I said. They don't. She looked down at the table between us for a moment, then back at me. I cannot undo my vote, she said. But I wanted you to know that I am paying attention. She stood and left before I could respond. I sat with that for a long time. Not with triumph, there was nothing triumphant about a delegate regretting a vote that had already passed. But with the particular awareness of a shift happening in the right direction, one person at a time, in the way that all real shifts eventually happen. On day 78, Director Orn called another session. This one was not informal. Senior security staff were present. 3 representatives from the Elder Council species sat in the elevated observer positions usually reserved for the presiding chair's advisory staff. The room had a quality to it that I recognized from previous experience with institutional power, the particular heaviness of a space where the decision has been made before the meeting opens and the meeting exists to announce it rather than reach it. The Galactic Council had authorized deployment of the Pale Armada. 72 warships. Assembled from the combined military assets of the 12 most powerful Council species, maintained as a permanent deterrent force, never deployed in its full strength since the conflict that had originally created it 3 centuries ago. It was the Council's most absolute response to a problem it had decided could not be managed by softer means. They were sending all of it to Earth. I sat with that information for a long moment after Director Orn finished speaking. 72 ships. To a planet that had fired no weapons. That had threatened no species. That had done nothing except find a legal path through a document designed to contain it and used that path to help people who needed help and ask uncomfortable questions about where the Council's data had come from. That was not the response of an institution acting from confidence. It was the response of something that had run out of proportionate answers and reached for the most disproportionate one available, hoping that scale could do what precision had failed to accomplish. I asked Director Orn what the Armada was authorized to do upon arrival. He told me, deliver an ultimatum. Earth would withdraw all colonial vessels to the Sol system, accept a Council inspection of its infrastructure and research programs, and cease all assistance activities in unaffiliated space. I asked what would happen if Earth declined. Director Orn did not answer. The absence of an answer was its own answer. I nodded. I thanked the committee. I walked back to my room. I sat on the edge of my bunk and looked at the wall and thought about 72 ships moving through FTL space toward a planet that had survived everything that had ever been aimed at it, and I thought, they have not asked themselves a single time what Earth will do that they have not expected. They were going to learn the answer in 11 days. Part 4, 72 ships and one idea. The Pale Armada arrived at the edge of the Sol system on day 89. 72 warships translated from FTL in the space of approximately 8 seconds, appearing in close formation at the boundary of Earth's outer sensor net with the precision of a fleet that had been conducting drills for exactly this kind of deployment for 30 years. Their arrival signatures were clean and deliberate. There was nothing accidental about how they came out of transit, spread in a pattern that covered all standard approach vectors to the inner system, every ship broadcasting its identification code on the Council's official military frequency, making themselves impossible to miss and impossible to misidentify. Commander Veshorin stood on the bridge of the leading ship and looked at his forward screens for a long moment. I know this because Veshorin described it to me himself, months later. He said he had prepared 2 scenarios on the transit from the Council station. In the first, Earth had used the drive recalibration that his intelligence analysts suspected but could not confirm to relocate as many vessels as possible, and the inner system would be defended only by whatever had stayed behind, a token presence that would make a show of resistance and then negotiate. In the second, Earth had managed to concentrate its ships from the unaffiliated systems into a defensive formation that would make the ultimatum delivery costly and complicated. In both scenarios, the Sol system would be largely empty. Whatever Earth had managed to build in 89 days, the Armada would arrive into open space and deliver its message and wait for a response. What Veshorin actually found on his sensors was neither of those things. 40 ships occupied Earth's orbital space. Not human ships. Ships from 40 different species, every single one of them a world that had appeared on Celia Ford's list, every single one of them a place where a human colonial vessel had spent 2 to 3 weeks in the previous 2 months repairing something that was broken. They were not arranged in any combat formation. They were not at combat readiness status. Their weapons systems, his sensor team confirmed within 60 seconds, were either minimal or entirely absent. They were vessels of the kind that mid-sized unaffiliated species used for trade and inter-system communication, practical, well-maintained, completely unsuited for any kind of engagement with a military fleet. They were there for the same reason that people stand outside a building when they want everyone to know what is happening inside it. And they were broadcasting on every open frequency in the quadrant, in the primary galactic tongue and in 14 secondary languages, a message that repeated on a continuous loop. We are here as witnesses. What happens to Earth, happens in front of the galaxy. Veshorin said the bridge was silent for approximately 4 minutes. His senior tactical officer spoke first. She said, in the careful voice of someone who is reporting information that changes all of the parameters, "Commander, I have no engagement protocol for this scenario." He said, "I know." Because there was genuinely no protocol for this. The Council had built the Armada as a deterrent and, if necessary, as an overwhelming force. It had wargamed every possible military scenario that could arise in the deployment against Earth. It had not wargamed a scenario in which the planet it was deploying against had, in 89 days, arranged for 40 unrelated species to park unarmed ships in its orbit and tell the rest of the galaxy to watch. If Veshorin fired on Earth, he would be firing in front of witnesses from 40 species that had recently received direct, personal help from the planet being fired upon. He would be firing while every listening post in the quadrant captured the event. He would be doing something that the Council had authorized in a closed chamber, surrounded by its own certainties, and it would happen in front of every species that had ever privately wondered whether the Council's version of justice was actually fair. He opened a communication channel to Earth. The person who answered was a man named Alan Cross. Alan was 62 years old, broad-shouldered, with gray hair that he kept short and a voice that had the particular quality of someone who has spent decades explaining difficult things to tired people and has learned that patience and clarity are not the same thing but both are necessary. He had spent most of his career managing large-scale food distribution logistics for Earth's most resource-stressed regions. He had been brought into the crisis team because someone recognized that the skills required to keep millions of people fed through a drought year, the ability to manage constraints creatively, to maintain calm in high-pressure situations, to find practical solutions to problems that seemed impossible from a distance, were exactly the skills required for what was happening now. He said, "Commander, we are very glad you've arrived. We've been hoping for the opportunity to speak with you directly." Veshorin said, "I have been authorized by the Galactic Council to deliver a formal communication." "And we will absolutely receive it," Alan said. "We are ready to discuss everything the Council has put forward. But before that, and Commander, you are entirely free to decline, we would like to extend an invitation to you personally." There was a pause on Veshorin's end of the channel. "An invitation. To share a meal with us. We have prepared food. We would like to sit across from you and talk, in the way that people talk when they are trying to understand each other rather than trying to win. The meal is being broadcast live, on open frequencies, so that everything that happens is visible to anyone who wants to see it." Alan paused. "We are not trying to gain an advantage from this. We genuinely believe that sitting at a table together, before anything formal happens, makes better outcomes more likely." Another pause. Longer this time. "You are asking me to come to the surface. We are entirely happy to host aboard a neutral vessel in orbit if you prefer," Alan said. "The Vethera delegation has offered their ship. They have a very comfortable reception room, and Olin Fair sends his personal regards." Veshorin said he needed time to consult with his advisory staff. Alan said there was absolutely no rush and that the food would keep. The dinner took place 36 hours later, aboard the Vethera delegation ship, the one whose irrigation network had been repaired by a human engineer named Sam Elliott 7 weeks earlier. Olin Fair, the Vethera captain, had given over his reception room with the careful formality of someone who understood that the event taking place in his ship was much larger than his ship and wanted to honor that without overshadowing it. It was broadcast live, on open frequencies, across every system within range. Which was most of the inhabited galaxy. I watched it from the Council station on the same public channel that everyone else was using. Alan arrived with 3 other members of Earth's working group, a logistics specialist named Donna Hayes, a materials engineer named Raj Patel, and a cultural historian named Ben Ashford who had spent 15 years studying galactic social structures. Veshorin arrived with 2 senior advisors. What followed was 2 hours that I watched without looking away. Alan asked questions. Not strategic questions, not political questions, questions that a person asks when they genuinely want to understand who they are talking to. How long had Veshorin served in the Council's fleet? What did command look like from inside the Armada? What was the Durathi home system known for beyond its military tradition? Veshorin answered carefully at first, with the controlled precision of a senior military officer receiving unexpected input. Then with slightly less control. Then with the ease of someone who has been asked real questions by someone who is actually listening to the answers. The food was human. Alan had selected it personally. Bread, shared in the flat round form that human cultures across history had used to mark hospitality. A thick lentil soup with a spice combination that Ben Ashford had confirmed, through 3 days of research, was unlikely to cause difficulty for Durathi sensory systems. Roasted root vegetables with oil and salt. Nothing elaborate. Nothing designed to impress. Food that was warm and real and shared. Veshorin looked at the bowl placed in front of him with a carefully neutral expression. His species consumed nutrient compounds formulated for their specific biology. There was nothing on the table that his body required or that his food history included. Alan said, "You genuinely do not have to eat any of it. This is not a test of anything. We just wanted to share the table with you, and if any of it is something you are willing to try, we hope you find it good." Veshorin picked up the implement provided for him. The Earth team had researched Durathi manual dexterity and produced a custom tool that worked with his physical structure, and tried the soup. He finished the bowl. He asked, in a voice that the broadcast captured clearly, whether there was more. Alan said yes and served it himself. That moment, a Durathi fleet commander holding a second bowl of human lentil soup, on a Vethera ship, broadcast to most of the inhabited galaxy, became the image that more people referenced when they discussed the turning point of the crisis than any formal statement, any legal argument, or any political maneuver. It was not a planned image. No one had choreographed it. It was simply what happened when two parties who had been treating each other as problems to be solved were, for 2 hours, just people at a table. The conversation at the table ranged wider as the hours passed. Ben Ashford asked Veshorin about the Durathi concept of duty, a subject that Veshorin engaged with more openly than any question about the Armada's orders. The Durathi, Ashford had researched, held a fundamental belief that duty required understanding the thing you were carrying out. You could not fulfill an obligation honestly if you had not looked at it from every angle. It was a cultural value so deep that it governed how Durathi commanders were trained. Before any engagement, they were required to build a complete picture of the entity they were engaging against. Veshorin had been building that picture for 11 days in transit. What he had found, Alan Cross had learned from a brief communication through one of the witness vessels before the dinner, was that the picture did not match the edict. The Durathi were not a species that carried out orders they had concluded were wrong. They were a species that said so, clearly and formally, and requested clarification. It was why the Council had used them as Armada commanders for 3 generations. It was also, in this specific moment, the thing that made Veshorin different from what the Council had expected him to be. Somewhere in the middle of the second hour, Donna Hayes, the logistics specialist, quiet through most of the meal, asked Veshorin a question that the broadcast captured and that was later, in multiple assessments of the dinner, identified as the pivot point of the entire conversation. She asked, "What would you have done, if we had not been here?" She meant the 40 ships. The witnesses. Veshorin was quiet for a long moment. His 2 advisors did not look at him. He did not look at them. "I would have delivered the ultimatum," he said. "And if Earth had declined?" Donna asked. Another long silence. "I do not know," he said. "I had not fully decided." And that was the most honest thing said at that table. A fleet commander in charge of 72 warships and a direct order from the Galactic Council, saying, "I had not decided." Not because he was weak. Because he was the kind of being who needed to understand what he was doing before he did it, and what he was being asked to do had not, on close inspection, stood up. Veshorin requested a 30-day operational pause for tactical reassessment. In the formal languages of Council procedure, that phrase was clean and unremarkable. But in the informal registers of most species communication, the way beings speak to each other when they are not being officially recorded, it meant something that everyone who heard it understood immediately. "I need time to decide whether this order is the right thing to carry out." Back at the council station, a secondary consequence of the dinner was unfolding that I had not anticipated. The 40 witness ships in Earth's orbit had not been there only to watch. Their captains were communicating with each other and, through their respective government channels, with their home worlds. Those home worlds were communicating with their council representatives. The representatives were receiving, by the time the dinner broadcast ended, a volume of incoming communication that was unusual in both quantity and tone. The messages were not demands. They were not ultimatums. They were inquiries. Careful, formally worded inquiries asking council representatives what the current legal status of Earth was, what the basis of the edict had been, and whether the council had considered that the species whose irrigation networks and food systems had been repaired in the previous 2 months might have a perspective on the matter that had not been included in the original proceedings. 412 votes had sealed the edict. The process of unsealing it had just begun in the communication inboxes of 412 delegate offices. On the council station, the broadcast had been cut from the official council screens within the first 20 minutes by the media management staff. But the delegates had their own devices and their own access to public channels, and they were watching. I knew they were watching because the station common areas, normally at low population in the evening hours, were crowded with beings gathered around screens, talking in the low urgent register of people whose predictions have stopped matching reality. I went to the observation deck. I stood at the window. Velkan came and stood beside me a few minutes later, which had become a habit between us that neither of us had formally acknowledged. "Your planet invited the Armada commander to dinner," he said. "Yes." "And he accepted." "He did. And now he is requesting a 30-day pause because of what appears to be lentil soup." I smiled at the stars outside. He seemed to like it. Velkan was quiet for a moment. "The chair has called a closed emergency session," he said. "You are not invited to attend." "I know," I said. He looked at me sideways, his silver eyes steady and unreadable in the way that had taken me weeks to stop trying to decode. "You are not concerned about that." I thought about the small recording device in my jacket pocket. I thought about the earpiece placed under the presiding chair's podium 3 weeks ago, broadcasting on a frequency designed to record for 40 days before its power cell required replacement. I thought about the session that was happening in a closed room while I stood here looking at stars. "No," I said. "I'm not." Velkan watched me for another long moment. Then he turned back to the stars. Neither of us said anything more. The session ran until the following morning. I went to sleep with my jacket on the chair beside my bed and the knowledge that everything happening in that room was being recorded, and that what I did with that recording in the next 12 hours would determine whether the next year of this story went the way I needed it to go. Part 5, What Came Next? I listened to the session from the beginning. The recording started clean, Chair Orenville's voice, the formal language of a closed proceeding, the attendance of the full advisory committee and 3 senior representatives from the elder council species. The Council's Intelligence Directorate began with a status brief that lasted 20 minutes and covered the Armada's position, the 40 witness vessels in Earth's orbit, and Veshoran's requested pause. Then the Intelligence Director, whose identity the Council protected behind a synthesized voice, delivered the section of the brief that I had been waiting for, and which changed the shape of everything I had been working with for 89 days. The Aggression Index. The data that the Council's edict preamble had cited as primary justification. The statistical framework that had told 412 species that humanity was too dangerous to leave uncontained. The brief confirmed what I had suspected since my second meeting with the advisory committee, that data had not been produced by the Council's own research bodies. It had been commissioned from a third-party analytical group whose funding traced, through a carefully constructed chain of holding entities, to 3 sources. 3 elder species. The 3 whose trade networks covered the majority of resource distribution across the Council's member worlds. The 3 who had spent a decade watching Earth's colonial expansion with the attention of people who have built a monopoly and are watching a competitor appear on the horizon. The data had been shaped. Not invented entirely, Earth's history provided genuine material, and the people who built the index had been skilled enough to work with real facts and arrange them into a frame that pointed toward a conclusion they needed the Council to reach. But the selection of which data to include, which to exclude, how to weight the variables, how to frame the historical incidents, all of it had been directed from the start toward a single outcome. Humanity was not a strategic threat. We were an economic one. And the edict had been the council's own institutional machinery, operated from inside by three parties with a financial stake in the result. I sat on the floor of my room with my back against the wall and the earpiece running, and I listened to all of it. Then I listened to the second part. The three elder species, speaking in the closed session with the candor that they believed only a closed room could allow, were not satisfied with the current situation. The 30-day pause Veshorin had requested was unacceptable. The dinner broadcast had caused, in their assessment, significant damage to the council's ability to manage the narrative around the edict. The Armada needed to proceed immediately, and its directive needed to be stronger than the original ultimatum. Not just compliance. Active disarmament. Earth's FTL program suspended indefinitely. Colonial vessels confiscated and placed under council inventory. All independent research programs subjected to ongoing council oversight. They called this a restructuring measure. They described it as necessary for galactic stability. What they meant was, make sure this species cannot grow fast enough to threaten what we have built. Director Orn pushed back. Other delegates pushed back. The session became an argument that lasted hours, circling the same points with the frustrating rhythm of a dispute where both sides have too much at stake to back down cleanly. I stopped the recording at hour 4. I had what I needed. I sat with the device in my hand and thought about what I was holding. The closed session recording of a Galactic Council meeting in which the three most economically powerful entities in the known galaxy admitted, in their own voices, that they had engineered false justification for an edict against a species that threatened their trade margins. Not their safety. Not galactic stability. Their margins. I thought about the 412 who had voted yes. Most of them had voted based on the data they were given. Most of them had looked at the aggression index, considered it seriously, and concluded that containment was a responsible answer to a real problem. They had been manipulated. They had been used as instruments of a private interest that had dressed itself as a collective concern. Most of them were not corrupt, they were wrong, and they were wrong because someone needed them to be. That distinction was the most important thing in what I was holding. Because if I released this recording as a weapon, if I broadcast it in a way that treated the council itself as the enemy, I would destroy the institution along with the three who had corrupted it. 412 species who had voted in genuine good faith would have that good faith turned into public humiliation. The Galactic Council, with all its failures and all its fears, was still the structure that kept the known galaxy from fracturing into the kind of conflict that ends civilizations. It was imperfect and it was compromised and it was the best thing available. I did not want to break it. I wanted to fix it. I spent the rest of that night writing 43 separate documents. 43 versions of the same essential information, each one calibrated for a different reader. For the small species on Celia's list who had received human help and were now watching nervously to see what would happen. For the junior delegates who had voted yes and had been showing, in ways I had been cataloging for weeks, signs of doubt that had nowhere to go. For the independent legal scholars who monitored council procedure. For the historians who specialized in the three elder species and their documented history of economic interference in council decisions. For the 12 senior delegates who had, in communications visible through the library's research access function, expressed private concern about the direction of the edict before the vote was ever called. I wrote to Velcon separately. Not the full recording. Just a message. The question you were afraid to ask has an answer. I have it. I need 12 hours before anything moves. Please give me 12 hours. His reply came in under 4 minutes. 4 words. You have the time. I began transmitting at midnight, staggering the messages across a 6-hour window, running each one through a different pathway in the library communication system so that no single monitoring protocol would catch the full picture before all 43 had gone. I did not sleep. By morning, the station had a different quality to it. Not loud, nothing about it was loud. But the corridors had a different density of motion than their usual rhythms, and the clusters of delegates speaking in low voices in the common areas were larger and stiller than they normally were, with the careful immobility of groups processing something significant. At 9 in the morning station time, 17 species issued simultaneous formal statements to the Council's public record. Each statement contained substantially the same text. In light of newly available evidence regarding the sourcing and methodology of the aggression index cited in the containment edict, this delegation formally withdraws its support from the edict and requests an immediate independent review of the underlying data and its origins. 17 in the first hour. By 10, 22. By noon, 29. The three elder species issued a combined response at 11:45. Procedural objection language, claims that the evidence had been improperly obtained, assertions that the index methodology was sound, arguments that the review request was an attempt to destabilize council authority by parties with an obvious interest in the outcome. It was articulate, technically proficient, and delivered with the confidence of people who have used institutional procedure as a shield many times before and believe it will hold. It did not hold. The recording was already distributed across too many independent systems to suppress. Legal scholars from non-member worlds had been analyzing it since before sunrise and were issuing assessments with the speed of people who had been watching council procedure for years and waiting for exactly this kind of evidence to emerge. Delegate after delegate issued their own statements, not all of them withdrawing from the edict, but all of them calling for the review. The language of the chamber was shifting the way tides shift, not in a single moment but in the accumulation of many small movements that, taken together, are impossible to stop. I was summoned before the full council at 2 in the afternoon. I had changed into my cleanest clothes, a simple dark jacket, plain trousers, nothing that would draw attention away from what I was going to say. I walked into the main chamber alone. No escort, no translator, no support staff. Just me and the empty center floor and 412 filled seats rising in their curved rows above me. The light panels were white. Not the executioner's blue of the edict session. White, which in council chamber protocol meant that no determination had been reached and the session was open. Presiding Chair Orenville looked at me from across the chamber floor. She did not look angry. That surprised me, and then it did not surprise me, because I had been studying her for 3 months and what she looked like was a being who has carried a significant weight for a long time and has just discovered that the weight was built on a false foundation. That is not the same as anger. That is something older and harder to carry. You have caused significant disruption to council procedure, she said. Yes, I said. I apologize for the disruption. I do not apologize for the disclosure. A murmur moved through the chamber. Not hostile, uncertain. The sound of a large group of beings processing two things at once and not yet sure how they fit together. The recording was obtained without authorization. It was obtained by a person who was being held on this station under constraint, in a room that had not been examined for monitoring devices because the security assessment concluded that the person in question posed no meaningful risk. I paused. The security assessment was working from an incomplete model. It assumed that a linguist with no official status was also a person without initiative. That assumption was the security gap, not my recording device. The murmur returned, slightly different in quality this time. Something in it that was closer to agreement than I had expected. You are asking the council to invalidate its own edict, Director Orn said from the second tier, his voice carrying the precise neutral of someone who has not yet decided which direction to move in. I am asking the council to be what it was designed to be, I said. A body that makes decisions based on accurate information, applied fairly, to all species equally. The three entities that shaped the aggression index did not want that. They wanted a body that would make a decision in their favor and dress it as a collective determination. Those are different things. 412 species voted in this chamber. Most of them voted in good faith, based on data they had reason to trust. They were used as instruments of an economic agenda that they were not informed about. They deserve better than that. The chamber was quieter than I had heard it. Director Orn said, "What specifically are you asking the council to do?" I had worked on this answer for longer than anything else in the past 89 days. Not the answer that would feel satisfying. Not the answer that expressed everything that had been done wrong. The answer that would actually work. That would make the next version of this problem structurally less likely to happen again. 3 things, I said. First, the containment edict is immediately suspended, and an independent review of the aggression index and its origins is conducted by a body that has no economic relationship with any of the 3 species whose funding has been identified in the sourcing. Second, the 3 entities who commissioned and provided the manipulated data are subject to the Council's existing accountability protocols for member species that provide false information in the context of an official proceeding. Those protocols exist. They have simply never been applied to species with enough economic weight to avoid them. Third, Article 12 of the Open Compact, the provision that allows any member species to submit data to inform a containment proceeding without independent verification, is amended to require third-party verification for any data used as the primary evidentiary basis of an edict. That gap is how this was possible. It needs to close. A longer murmur. Many voices in many languages, running through the chamber like water finding its level. Orenville raised one of her 4 hands and the sound subsided. She looked at me with the steady gaze of someone who has been in this chamber for 60 years and has learned to read the weight of a moment. "You are not angry," she said. "No." "Why not?" I thought about the question honestly. Not the diplomatic answer. The true one. Because anger would be appropriate if what I wanted was to see the council broken apart, I said. That is not what I want. I want a galaxy that works. One where the edict structure cannot be used by whoever has enough money to commission the data that justifies it. One where small species are not exploited as leverage by larger economic interests. One where a planet can develop at its own pace without that development being treated as an inherent threat to be contained. I let a beat pass. The council has 412 members. Most of them are ordinary. Most of them are trying to govern responsibly with the information they have. The problem was not the council. The problem was what certain parties were putting into the council's information stream. Fix that, and the council becomes what it was supposed to be. Orenville looked at me for a long moment. Then she looked out at the 412 filled seats above us. Then she called the vote. The edict suspension passed at 389 to 23. The 3 elder species voted no, every other vote was yes. Even 9 of the species that had, 4 months ago, been among the most vocal supporters of the edict voted yes. The numbers sat in the chamber record with the permanence of things that have been formally witnessed and cannot be unmade. The accountability proceedings were referred to the council's legal body. The Article 12 amendment was placed on the formal session agenda. The Pale Armada was recalled. Veshorin confirmed receipt of the recall order via official channel at 4:17 in the afternoon. At 4:22, a second message arrived at Alan Cross's communication address. Unofficial, carrying no fleet identification. It contained no words. Only an image, a clean, empty bowl. Alan replied with a single word, anytime. I stood in the chamber after the session ended. For the second time in 3 months, I was the last person left in a room that had just decided something about Earth's place in the galaxy. The first time, the light had been cold and blue and final. This time it was warm and white and still in the process of becoming something. Velkan came and stood beside me. "They will try again," he said. "Not the same way. But the forces that drove this do not go away because a session went against them." "I know. You are not concerned." I looked at the empty seats and thought about 412 species. Most of them ordinary. Most of them trying. Most of them capable of being used badly and also capable of choosing differently when they had real information to work with. "You know what is interesting about a galaxy full of different civilizations," I said. "Tell me." "Most of them are dealing with the same fundamental problems. How to distribute resources fairly. How to make collective decisions that don't get captured by whoever has the most money. How to build systems that work for everyone in them rather than only for the people who designed them. Humans have been working on those problems on one planet for 10,000 years. We made every possible mistake. We caused enormous harm along the way. But we developed every approach that has ever been tried, every framework for power sharing, every method for institutional accountability, every type of structural design for keeping concentrated interests from determining collective outcomes." I paused. The council is 900 years old. It has never had a member with 10,000 years of case studies in exactly this problem. Velkan considered this carefully. "Is that supposed to be reassuring?" I turned from the chamber and walked toward the door. "Honestly," I said, "a little." 6 months later, Earth tabled the Open Compact restructuring proposal. A new oversight body, equal representation regardless of economic size, mandatory evidentiary review for any data underpinning a containment proceeding, third-party verification required for all formal edict submissions. The vote was 394 to 18. I was not in the chamber. I was on a transport heading home, watching the result arrive on a small screen in my cabin. Flat text, official transmission formatting, completely unadorned. 394 to 18. I put the screen down. Outside the window, the stars moved past in the easy drift of a ship going somewhere at a speed slow enough to watch. I thought about the word I had sent 89 days into this. 7 characters, sent through a closing channel, the last communication before the blackout. Adapt. Earth had adapted into exactly what it had always been, given enough room to be it, stubborn, creative, generous in the specific way that creatures become generous when they understand how much surviving difficult things costs, and how unnecessary it is to let others face those costs alone. Not perfect. Not without history. Not without the record of everything we had done to each other over 10,000 years of learning how power works. But also that. The learning. 10,000 years of it. I leaned back in my seat and closed my eyes. Somewhere ahead, still hours away by ordinary transit, Earth was doing what it always did, building, arguing, making mistakes, fixing them. Going about the ordinary complicated business of being itself. The most statistically anomalous species in the known galaxy. The only civilization anyone had documented that looked at a cage and spent 89 days turning it into a door. I thought about Velkon's question on the observation deck. About the 412 votes in the 3 elder species and the cold blue light of the edict chamber. I thought, the council voted against us. They voted with manufactured data and economic fear and the confident certainty of people who have never had to adapt because they have never faced what we have faced. They voted against us, and they did not ask what we would do next. What came next was this: we showed up. We fixed things that needed fixing. We sat at tables. We served soup. We asked questions about data sources. We built friendships in open space while a kill grid showed our ships as dormant. We stood in an empty chamber and told 412 species what their own institution was supposed to be. And then we went home. And we started writing the next chapter, which would be better than the last one, because that is the one thing humanity has always managed to do. The stars outside my window burned with the same indifferent permanence they had always had. They did not care about any of this. We did. That was the difference. We always have.